Miss Marple encounters a distressed woman wandering through St. Mary Mead, unable to recall her own name or past. Whispers of a hidden identity, a stolen inheritance, and a crime long buried begin to surface. With her keen intuition, Miss Marple must piece together the woman's forgotten life before danger finds her first. Chapter 1. The Woman at the Vicarage Gate. On the first Sunday of September, the air in St. Anne's Mead smelled of overripe apples and the last of the summer roses. Church bells rang crisply across the quiet village, their peal as punctual and well-behaved as the ladies in the front pew. And in the thickening light of early evening, a woman in a lemon-yellow cardigan stood quite still outside the vicarage gate, staring at the hedge with the forlorn attentiveness of someone trying to remember what she had come for. Reverend Paul Crampton noticed her from his study window. She had been standing there for 5 minutes. He glanced at the clock, a charming brass relic gifted to the vicarage by a long-dead parishioner, and, after another moment of hesitation, decided he could not in good conscience let the matter pass. He stepped outside, buttoning his wool cardigan against the gathering chill. "May I help you, madam?" he asked gently, his voice low and kind, a habit born from years of funerals and gentle reprimands at parish meetings. The woman turned slowly. Her eyes were wide and a bit too bright. "I'm not quite sure," she said. "Are you unwell?" "No, at least, I don't think so." She looked down at her hands as if surprised to find them there. "I was trying to go somewhere. I thought this was the place, but now I can't say why. Do you live nearby?" A beat passed. Her expression tightened slightly. "I don't know," she whispered. The Reverend blinked. "Perhaps you'd come in and sit for a moment?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, that would be kind." Inside the vicarage, over a cup of lukewarm chamomile tea, she seemed more composed, though no less confused. Her name, she explained, or thought she explained, was Margaret, or Margaret Ann, or possibly just Ann. There had been a train, she remembered that, and the sound of rain against glass, but no ticket, no luggage, and no clear sense of purpose. Mrs. Crampton, summoned from her embroidery, took one look at the woman and fetched a blanket, a plate of digestives, and her most inquisitive expression. She was a sharp-eyed woman, used to cataloging sins under the guise of concern. "You're not from St. Anne's Mead, that's certain," she said, more to herself than the stranger. "We'd have known of you." "I think I'm from Wiltshire," said the woman. "Or my sister is. Or perhaps she's dead." The Cramptons exchanged a glance. "Have you any identification?" asked Mrs. Crampton gently. "None." "Any idea how you arrived here?" "I don't remember getting off the train, or even where I boarded. That night, the woman was offered the guest room and, despite Mrs. Crampton's tight-lipped hesitation, made comfortable. The police were notified the next morning, and Inspector Graves from the county station arrived by noon. A stocky, sensible man. He took one look at the woman and said she reminded him of his cousin who got migraines and read too much Wolf. "No crime here," he muttered. "More likely a bout of nerves. Temporary amnesia, could be. We'll wire around the nearby stations. She'll be claimed soon enough." But by the end of the week, no claim had come, and the woman whom the village had begun referring to as Miss Ann remained in the guest room, tending to the Cramptons' dahlias and speaking in quiet riddles about books she half remembered and sisters she might have had. It was at this point that Mrs. Crampton suggested inviting Miss Marple. "She has such a way with people," she said, folding napkins with exaggerated precision, "especially the fragile ones." Miss Marple was indeed invited for tea the following Tuesday, and, being of a disposition both curious and serviceable, she agreed. She arrived with a tin of shortbread and a soft blue shawl, her white hair pinned precisely and her eyes sparkling behind the most innocent spectacles ever to disguise genius. She sat with Misson in the garden, beneath the arbor where the roses had begun to brown, You have such clever hands," Miss Marple said after a time, watching the woman trim back a stalk. "Very sure. Not the hands of someone accustomed to idleness. I used to knit and garden, but perhaps that's only because you say so. Perhaps I'm just trying to be what people expect of me." "Oh, people expect all sorts of foolish things," Miss Marple replied, brushing a bit of leaf from her lap. "It's only by watching what they overlook that you get at the truth of them. But you've come to us a little like a ghost, haven't you?" Missin flinched, then smiled faintly. "Yes, I do feel that way. As if I were haunting myself. And have you had any dreams?" "Dreams? Yes, often the subconscious leaves breadcrumbs." The woman was silent for a long time. "I dreamed of lavender," she said finally, "and a brass doorknob that was very cold." Miss Marple said nothing, but filed it away. That night, just after the church clock struck 11, the peace of St. Anne's Mead was shattered. The Cramptons' tabby, an ancient and rather cranky creature named Muffin, began to wail from the garden. The Reverend, clutching his dressing gown, rushed out with a torch and found the back gate wide open and Missin gone. A trail of trampled grass led to the lane behind the house, and there, just before the hedgerow turned toward the wood, lay something pale and motionless in the dark. It was not Missin. It was Miss Barton, the postmistress. Her throat was bruised, and she was very, very dead. Chapter 2. A Village of Theories. By dawn, the news had seeped through St. Anne's Mead like rain through old thatch. Miss Barton reliable. No nonsense, Miss Barton was dead. Not fallen or fainted or mysteriously unwell, but unmistakably, irretrievably dead. "Strangled," said Reverend Crampton, grim-faced and pale, at the breakfast table. "Murdered," whispered Mrs. Longstreet with almost relish as she handed her cleaning woman a tin of ginger. Biscuit she suddenly no longer wanted. Within hours, the village had divided itself into two camps: those who remembered every moment Miss Barton had ever annoyed them, and those who, in light of her sudden absence, had transformed her into a beloved pillar of the community. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat quietly by her parlor window with a piece of crochet she was not really working on. The paper had not yet arrived, but the news had beaten the post. Of course, dear Mr. Felton, the station master, had come round personally to deliver the message. "Thought you'd want to hear it properly," he'd said with visible excitement, as though bringing her the results of the village fete raffle. "Strangled behind the vicarage garden." Oh dear, Miss Marple murmured. "How very strange. And poor Miss Barton too." Felton nodded. "They say she wasn't expected out at that hour. Never stayed out past 9, not with her sinuses. And her radio quiz, she never missed it. That's why people are saying, well, yes." Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well, some are saying it's to do with that odd woman. The one with no name." Miss Marple offered no opinion, but gave a very slight nod, which Felton took as agreement. In the village shop, meanwhile, the speculation was thick as the dust on the marmalade jars. Mrs. Larch, who had recently taken to wearing black as a preventative measure, leaned across the counter and said to Mrs. Ridgway, "I knew something was off about her. That yellow cardigan. No Englishwoman with dignity wears yellow in autumn. To be fair, she didn't seem to know anything," replied Mrs. Ridgway, who had once briefly considered Miss Barton a rival for the Widow Granger's favor. "And I heard she asked if we were near Devon." "Devon? Was it the woman who did it then?" piped up Ada, the butcher's daughter, with undisguised excitement. "They say she vanished right after," whispered Mrs. Larch. "Not a trace. Not even her toothbrush left behind." "She had a toothbrush?" Ada frowned. "Well, someone must have brought her one. That or the Cramptons lent her theirs." Back at the vicarage, Inspector Graves had returned, less confident than before. The disappearance of Miss Anne and the death of Miss Barton had turned what was previously an oddity into something far more urgent. He interviewed the Cramptons again, and both gave accounts that, while consistent, were frustratingly unhelpful. She seemed calm, said Reverend Crampton. A bit fogged, certainly, but nothing violent. We left her with a cup of tea around 10, and she said she'd go to bed shortly. And the back gate, Graves asked, always latched. I checked it myself earlier that evening. Double quotes Mrs. Crampton, more flustered than usual, hovered near the fireplace. If I might say, she said hesitantly, she was always staring at the wood line, as though she expected someone to come from there, or to return to it. Graves muttered. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage. She brought a jar of her special plum preserve, which Mrs. Crampton accepted with forced civility. Still rattled from the morning's scandal, Miss Marple, unfazed, asked to see the room Misson had occupied. It was a modest guest room with flowered curtains and a writing desk that looked unused. The bed had been made that morning more out of habit than necessity. As no one had slept in it the night before, there's nothing of hers left, Mrs. Crampton said, voice tight, not even a hairpin. And I assure you, we didn't touch a thing. It's as though she never existed. Miss Marple approached the desk. May I? Of course. She opened the top drawer and found nothing except a dried-out ink bottle and a scrap of paper. She lifted the paper gently. It was blank but folded, as if it had once carried a message or had been tucked into a pocket. She didn't say anything, but her fingers brushed over the surface, feeling faint indentations. Perhaps writing, long since rubbed out. Has anyone looked into Miss Barton's evening rote? She asked, almost idly. I believe she went to return a book. Reverend Crampton offered from the doorway, looking fatigued. She said something about borrowing a history of Devon from Mr. Lytton. Odd. Now that I think about it, she wasn't usually one for county history. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed faintly. Mr. Lytton from the Library Society? Yes, that is odd. Later that day, she made her way to Mr. Lytton's cottage, a narrow place full of uneven bookshelves and perpetually closed curtains. Mr. Lytton, a soft-spoken man with brittle wrists and an encyclopedic knowledge of British rail stations, answered the door looking startled. Miss Marple. What a literary surprise. I hear Miss Barton may have visited you yesterday evening, she said sweetly. He hesitated. Yes, she returned the volume I lent her last week. She said it hadn't helped. She was researching a location, had only vague recollections, said something about lavender and a brass doorknob. I lent her a guidebook to West Country Estates, but she seemed disappointed. And you saw her leave safely? I walked her to the gate. She said she'd go straight home. Miss Marple's smile was kind, but her gaze was sharp. Did she mention Miss Anne? Mr. Lytton looked uncomfortable, only to say that she thought the woman might be from one of the old homes near Chudleigh. Something about the way she spoke, a sort of educated slant. But then again, Miss Barton loved to guess at people. As she stepped outside, Miss Marple paused beside his rose trellis. Lavender and brass, she murmured. Curious pairing. By the time she returned to her cottage, dusk was beginning to fall. She sat down by her writing desk and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Within it were tiny observations, not facts, precisely, but impressions. Like breadcrumbs for the mind, she wrote, Misson forgets own name, but recalls details. Lavender. Doorknob. Miss Barton investigates on her behalf. Miss Barton found something. Miss Barton is dead. Misson vanishes same night. Outside, someone passed by on a bicycle, their wheels clicking like knitting needles on cobblestone. Miss Marple tapped her pencil against the page, then underlined the final point, across the lane. A curtain twitched at Mrs. Larch's window. The village, it seemed, was preparing for a long night of theories. And in the hedgerow, unnoticed beneath the falling twilight, a single yellow button plastic, large and slightly cracked, lay half buried in the earth. just off the path between the vicarage and the woods. Chapter 3. Whispers at the Library Society. The morning following Miss Barton's funeral dawned unusually clear, as if the heavens themselves were attempting to rinse the village clean of the unease that had settled like fog. But grief lingered in pockets, clinging to the edges of conversation, flickering behind polite smiles. St. Anne's Mead had buried its most dependable citizen, and no one quite knew how to return to the ordinary. At the post office, a replacement clerk from Hathersla was scheduled to arrive the following Monday. Until then, Mrs. Ridgway had taken it upon herself to deliver letters by hand, a task she approached with the grave solemnity of a wartime messenger. She wore a black beret, draped herself in scarves, and whispered to the garden hedges, "No post for you, I'm afraid. It's been quite a time." Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued to observe. Her walks through the village seemed as leisurely as always, pausing to examine a cabbage in Greaves' grocer, asking after a neighbor's rheumatism, but her mind worked relentlessly beneath the surface. She had lived long enough to know that murder, particularly when cloaked in confusion and silence, did not exist in isolation. It was a symptom, not a cause, and the illness of this village had roots. That morning, she decided to return to the St. Anne's Literary and Historical Society, a modest, wood-paneled hall tucked behind the chapel. It was often overlooked, save for the monthly lectures or the annual auction of out-of-date books. But to Miss Marple, it was a hive buzzing not with activity, but with the accumulated habits and tensions of the village's quieter residents. Inside, she found Mr. Lytton cataloging new donations, surrounded by fragile volumes and a faint smell of camphor. A warm fire burned behind a grate, and he wore fingerless gloves that made him look like a Dickensian librarian lost in time. "Miss Marple," he said, standing with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Twice in 1 week. What an honor," she returned the smile. "I had hoped to return the West Country guidebook Miss Barton borrowed. I thought perhaps, if she didn't mark her pages, we might learn what she was looking for by where she left the creases." Lytton hesitated. "The guidebook's gone, I'm afraid." "Gone? Missing? Or misfiled?" "She returned it, but I can't seem to find it on the shelves or in the log." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him a moment. "And the page she mentioned, lavender and a brass doorknob?" Lytton looked vaguely embarrassed. "I remember the page. It described an estate lavender dell in Chudla, a minor house long out of use, bombed partially during the war, I believe, though it did have brass fittings." "Yes," she nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And is there any connection between that estate and anyone in our village?" He blinked. "Not that I know of. But Miss Barton was very taken with the mystery of it. She even mentioned she thought Miss Anne's manner of speech resembled a governess she once knew, who had trained in Devon. It seemed rather fanciful." Frankly, Miss Marple turned toward the rows of shelves, letting her fingers trail gently along the spines. "You know," she said softly, "I believe nothing in villages is fanciful, only forgotten." A cough sounded behind her. Turning, she saw young Miss Violet Markham standing in the doorway with her usual uncertain posture, a tall girl with the complexion of skimmed milk and an air of perpetual apology. Violet was the type who seemed always to be waiting for someone to speak first. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said to the air between them. "Not at all, Miss Markham," Miss Marple said. "We were only discussing a vanished book." "Oh." Violet looked to Lytton. "It might have been me. I took some donations home to sort. I wasn't thinking. If I come across it, do let us know," Miss Marple said, smiling gently. But Violet's face remained troubled. "Actually, I meant to say something about Miss Barton." Both Lytton and Miss Marple turned toward her. "She came to see me the day before she died," Violet said, twisting her gloves. She asked if I knew any women who'd lived in Devon in the 1930s. She mentioned a woman named Eleanor Vane, or Vine, or Viney. I told her I didn't, but the name stayed with me. Miss Marple's expression shifted very slightly. And did she say why she asked? No, Violet said. Only that she thought Missin might be connected to her somehow. As Violet left the library, clearly unsettled by her own memory, Miss Marple turned back to Lytton. Does the name Eleanor Vine mean anything to you? He shook his head. But I could check the old rolls. We keep archives of local family registries. That would be most helpful. That evening, in the soft hush of her parlor, Miss Marple sat with a new list before her. Lavender Dell Estate, Chudla, brass fittings, Eleanor Vine, vain potential link to Miss Anne. Miss Barton found something. Died within hours. Guidebook missing. She tapped the end of her pencil. It's not just about memory, she murmured. It's about someone else's fear of being remembered. Just then, a sharp knock came at the door. Miss Marple, rarely surprised by anything, blinked only once before rising. It was Inspector Graves. His coat wet with mist. Evening, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Inspector. Come in, tea. No, thank you. He stepped inside. I thought I should inform you quietly that we've found a witness. Miss Marple's eyebrow arched. A tramp. Lives out by the old quarry road. Claims he saw a woman matches Miss N's description running toward the train tracks. Just before midnight on the night Miss Barton was killed. Running? Yes, and she was crying. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And you believe him? Graves grimaced. He's had more cider than sense most days. But he pointed out something else, said she dropped something. Our men went searching this morning and found this. He handed over a clear envelope. Inside was a handkerchief, monogrammed with the letter E for Eleanor. Miss Marple murmured, possibly, or Anne's real name, if she ever gave it. There's no other identifying feature. No blood, no makeup stain. Just a handkerchief, dropped in the dark. Miss Marple looked up at him, calm as ever. You know, Inspector, I do believe our mystery woman may have been far more aware than she pretended. Pretended? Oh yes, she said softly. For if she truly remembered nothing, she would not have gone searching for a name outside. The mist thickened into a quiet drizzle. In the woods beyond the village, the birds had stopped singing early, and in a forgotten corner of Chudla, where ivy clung to shattered windows and lavender grew wild along cracked paths, a long-abandoned house still held the scent of memories someone had gone to great lengths to erase. Chapter 4. The Quiet House with Lavender Walls. It was Miss Marple's long-held belief that the past never truly buried its dead. It merely rearranged them into the furniture of memory-odd creaks in the floorboards. Misplaced names, the particular way someone hesitated before answering a simple question. And so, when she stepped out of the station taxi on the edge of Chudla the next morning, she did so with a familiar mix of caution and expectation. Lavender Dell, as it turned out, was not entirely a ruin. The main structure remained upright, though war had taken its toll. The upper windows were jagged hollows, and much of the west wing had collapsed beneath ivy and weather. Yet the central door still stood, brass knob dulled with age, a faded knocker shaped like a dove suspended in mid-flight. It was Miss Marple's long-held belief that the past never truly buried its dead. It merely rearranged them into the furniture of memory-odd creaks in the floorboards. Misplaced names, the particular way someone hesitated before answering a simple question. And so, when she stepped out of the station taxi on the edge of Chudla the next morning, she did so with a familiar mix of caution and expectation. Lavender Dell, as it turned out, was not entirely a ruin. The main structure remained upright, though war had taken its toll. The upper windows were jagged hollows, and much of the west wing had collapsed beneath ivy and weather. Yet the central door still stood, brass knob dulled with age, a faded knocker shaped like a dove suspended in mid-flight. A small wooden sign, hand-painted, leaned at a slant by the garden wall. Private. Miss Marple naturally ignored it. The garden had once been tended with care. Rows of lavender still thrust up defiantly between the weeds, scenting the air with sweetness gone faintly musty. She moved slowly up the gravel path, noting the scuffed stone steps, the rusted trellis, and the faint marks where a nameplate had once been nailed and later removed. A sound scraping metal against stone caught her ear just as she reached the porch. She turned. A woman, dressed in plain brown gardening clothes and a battered sun hat, stood beside a wheelbarrow. She looked to be in her late 60s, with strong shoulders and a face weathered more by worry than sun. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, not unkindly, but with the guarded tone of someone used to strangers asking too many questions. "I hope so," Miss Marple replied. "My name is Jane Marple. I believe this house was once called Lavender Dell." The woman paused. "That's the name it had. You're not from the council, are you?" "No, I'm here on behalf of a missing woman." This caught the woman's attention. She put down her shears. "A missing woman?" "Yes, she was found wandering in St. Anne's a fortnight ago, with no memory of her name. She recalled only the scent of lavender and a brass doorknob." The woman went very still. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "She came here, didn't she?" She remembered. "You knew her?" "I knew who she might be," the woman said. "I wasn't sure." She didn't say much. "Did she come here recently?" "Yes, 5 days ago, just before the postmistress died." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but something in her eyes narrowed. "And what did she want?" She asked about the house, asked if it had belonged to the Vine family, and did it. The woman nodded. "It was once, before the war, before everything fell apart." "And Eleanor Vine?" Miss Marple pressed. The woman hesitated. I worked here when I was a girl, for Miss Eleanor's father. The family was troubled. Eleanor was kind, though, a bit fragile but kind. She disappeared in 1939. They said she'd gone to stay with cousins in France, but I never believed that." "Do you recall if Eleanor had a child?" The woman looked away. There were whispers. "A baby born in secret. I never saw it. Only once. I heard crying in the upstairs nursery when no one else was in the house. After that, the whole wing was locked." "Do you recall the father's name?" "Charles Vine. Very stern man, ex-Navy. After Eleanor vanished, he kept the house sealed. He died during the Blitz. There was no one left to claim it." Miss Marple turned toward the house, which now seemed less abandoned and more watchful. "I believe the woman who came here, the one who forgot her name, was Eleanor's child," she said softly. The woman bowed her head. "Then that makes her the last Vine." Miss Marple looked around. "And when she left, how did she seem?" "Shaken. She said something about finally knowing why no one ever came for her. Then she left. I thought she might go to the authorities, but..." The woman looked troubled. "You say she's missing?" "Yes, and Miss Barton, the postmistress who tried to help her, was killed the same night." The woman paled. "Then someone still wants the past kept buried." Miss Marple returned to St. Anne's Mead by early evening, her bag heavier with thoughts than with any physical item. On her way home, she passed the vicarage and paused. Reverend Crampton was tending his front hedge with distracted precision. "She's still missing," he said before she spoke. "Miss Anne, she is," Miss Marple said. "But I believe she was never truly lost, only hidden." Reverend Crampton looked up. "You think someone knows who she is?" "I believe someone has always known, and that knowledge was dangerous." To Miss Anne and to Miss Barton, that night, Miss Marple did not sleep. Instead, she sat at her desk with the small collection of clues she had gathered: the lost guidebook, the monogrammed handkerchief, the mention of Eleanor Vine, the secret nursery, the frightened child grown into a frightened woman. And one more thing, the yellow button found near the woods. She took it from the envelope Graves had provided and examined it anew. It was plastic, yes, but of a style common in the 1940s, larger, sewn for utility rather than fashion, and she remembered something else. Miss Ann's cardigan, lemon yellow, fastened with plastic buttons. All of them accounted for. Until that night, she turned to her notebook and wrote, "Yellow cardigan button. Must have come loose during struggle or flight. Likely confrontation took place between Miss Barton and someone else. Miss Ann fled, but not the attacker. There was a knock on the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Inspector Graves once more. His expression was tired, but his eyes were sharper than before. We found something," he said, double quotes, yes, a piece of paper in Miss Barton's handbag, torn but legible. It says, "Ellen Orvine's daughter, Lavender Dell, alive." Miss Marple's breath caught. Then she knew, and someone else must have known she knew. Graves nodded. "We're working backwards now. Phone logs, letters, anything Miss Barton may have sent. But the motive is clear. To prevent the truth of Miss Ann's identity," Miss Marple said. "Yes, but why? She's not a criminal, no. But she may be an heir." Graves looked confused. "An heir to something more than property," Miss Marple said. "To a secret, to shame, and perhaps to revenge." Outside, rain began to fall again, soft as silk on the rooftops. The village, once sleepy and slow, now held its breath somewhere. Miss Ann, who was not Miss Ann, was hiding, not from the world, but from a name. And Miss Marple, always listening, always watching, began to see how the pieces might fit. Chapter 5. The Ghost in the Record Books. By midday the next morning, St. Anne's Mead wore the weight of too much silence. Even the children playing near the chapel grounds seemed subdued, their chalk drawings interrupted halfway with distracted squiggles. In the heart of the village, Miss Marple sat at her dining table with a pot of tea growing cold beside her. Across from her sat Inspector Graves, leafing through a sheaf of papers that had arrived from the county archives. "They found something odd," he said, tapping the top page. "Eleanor Vine's official records list her as unmarried, but there's a single entry from 1938 listing a female birth under her name. No father noted. The child's first name has been blacked out, redacted." Miss Marple, knitting in hand, nodded. "And the record was sealed?" "Yes, and marked with a wartime code, relocation due to national security. That's very rare." "Or very convenient," Miss Marple murmured. Graves leaned back. "You think it's a fabrication?" "I think someone went to great lengths to obscure the child's trail. That suggests two things. Either the child was placed with someone influential, or someone very ashamed." Graves frowned. "Wouldn't that make Eleanor's father the most likely candidate?" "Charles Vine." Miss Marple set her knitting down. "I've been considering Charles Vine. Naval man, rigid reputation, known to be particular about his legacy. A daughter bearing an illegitimate child would have humiliated him. Enough to disown her, enough to disappear her." Graves's jaw tightened. Miss Marple continued, "What if the child wasn't relocated to a loving home, but hidden, kept in a quiet institution, renamed, disconnected from her roots? She grows up with faint memories, lavender, brass doorknobs, but nothing tangible. She wanders into St. Anne's Mead decades later, pulled by something she can't explain." Graves looked troubled. "Then why show up now?" "That's the question," Miss Marple said. "Trauma works in spirals. Perhaps she had a trigger, a scent, a memory, a word. Or perhaps someone found her and wanted to make sure she stayed confused." He rubbed his chin. "Miss Barton thought she'd cracked the case, and then she died." "Precisely. A short while later." Miss Marple made her way across the green to the small, squat brick building that housed the village records. There she found Mr. Hensley, the aging clerk, nodding off above a desk of open ledgers. He startled awake as she entered. Oh, Miss Marple. Sure enough, in the 1944 parish census, she found an entry. Household, Mrs. Harriet Dunn, widow. Age 67, dependent, Margaret Ann, female. Age 6, relationship, border source, transferred from London. 1939. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. Mr. Hensley, she called gently. He returned with a stack of folders, dust streaking his cardigan. Yes? Do you recall Mrs. Dunn? Oh, yes. Lived near the woods, west end of the village. Died just after the war. Kept to herself mostly. Took in a few children over the years. Odd bird. Do you remember any of the children? He frowned. One girl, quiet, yellow hair, always standing behind the hedge when you passed by. Disappeared after the old woman died. Miss Marple nodded. And no one questioned that? She wasn't one of ours, you see. No family, no school records. Assumed she'd been relocated. Or hidden again, Miss Marple murmured. She returned to her cottage with the copied census page pressed between her gloves. Like something sacred, there was no doubt in her mind now. The woman known as Missin had grown up here, forgotten by everyone except the wind and the trees. That afternoon, the village held its breath once more when a rumor surfaced. Someone had seen the woman again by the old mill lane, her yellow cardigan just visible beneath her coat, a ghost walking in daylight. But when Graves dispatched officers, they found nothing. Only the scent of lavender in the air and a single footprint near the streambank. Miss Marple, however, had begun to suspect something else. The killer, whoever it was, had not expected the woman to come back. And now they were searching too. She sat again with her notes. Too many threads, but they were drawing together. Charles Vine, reputation-driven, cold. Eleanor, likely institutionalized or silenced. Daughter hidden as Margaret Ann, reappears in St. Anne's Mead. Miss Barton investigates. Killed. Someone's still afraid. She added one more line. The person most desperate to bury the truth must have known both Eleanor and the child, which meant they were still in the village. And watching. Chapter 6. A knocking beneath the ivy. Word count. 1,200. Rain fell lightly over St. Anne's Mead the next morning. Not enough to soak the earth, but enough to turn the air damp and close. The kind of day where nothing seemed to dry, and every window wept with condensation. But the weather did not deter Miss Marple. If anything, it added a peculiar clarity to her purpose. The threads were converging. And now, she suspected, someone was about to unravel. She walked, umbrella tapping softly, past the green, past the library, and down toward the edge of the woods. Her destination was the crumbling cottage once owned by Harriet Dunn, now empty. Its shutters sealed, its garden long reclaimed by moss and bramble. The thatch roof sagged at the corners, and ivy curled around the stone chimney like a strangler's fingers. Miss Marple paused at the rusted gate. No one had been seen entering or leaving the place for years. The property, the vicar had once mentioned in passing, had fallen into disuse after Don's death. No heirs had come forward. The land had simply waited. She opened the gate with a protesting squeal and stepped through. Careful of the slick stones beneath her feet, the door was unlatched. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew and the faint, dry scent of rotted wood. The furnishings had been left in place, an armchair by the fireplace, lace curtains gone gray with dust, a table with a single cracked teacup still sitting on it as though someone had once meant to return. Miss Marple moved slowly, her sharp eyes missing nothing. A photo frame had fallen to the floor, its glass broken. She picked it up. Inside was a sepia portrait of an elderly woman, Harriet Dunn, no doubt beside a child whose face had been scratched out deliberately. But the shoulders were narrow, and the cardigan faded but still yellow was unmistakable. She exhaled softly. So the child had remained here longer than assumed, perhaps until adolescence. And then she turned toward the small hallway that led to the back room. The floorboards groaned underfoot. There was a cupboard at the end, half open, dark. Miss Marple pulled it wide and stepped back. Inside were several old toys, a wooden soldier, a broken rocking horse, and most oddly a small, tarnished nameplate. She wiped it clean with a handkerchief. The letters were faint but legible. Evie Eleanor Vine. Miss Marple stood very still. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, one soft knock from somewhere behind the rear wall. Then another. It was not the sound of something falling. It was patterned, deliberate. 3 knocks, pause. 2 knocks, pause. 1 knock. She didn't move, only listened. Silence. Then footsteps. Behind the house. Quickly, she tucked the nameplate into her pocket and moved to the window. A man in a dark raincoat was retreating toward the trees, his stride swift, head lowered. Not a stranger, someone local. She recognized the gait, but in the rain and distance, the face eluded her. Back in her cottage later that afternoon, she laid out the pieces. Someone had returned to Harriet Dawn's house recently and quietly. They had searched it, possibly looking for remnants that might identify Miss Anne. The scratched photograph, the missing toys, and the knocks. Was someone trying to signal? Miss Marple turned this over in her mind. It would be just like a child raised in secrecy to learn knocking as communication, especially if they had been kept hidden. The doorbell rang. It was Violet Markham, looking pale and anxious, her scarf tied tightly around her throat. "Miss Marple," she said quickly, "I shouldn't be here. I don't even know why I came, but something's wrong." Miss Marple stepped aside and motioned her in. "Sit down, dear. Would you like some tea?" "No." "Yes." "I don't know." Violet wrung her hands. "I was walking past the woods this morning, and I thought I saw someone. A woman, in the clearing near the old millstone. She looked right at me." "Describe her." Violet's voice dropped. Her hair was longer now, tied back, but I think it was Miss Anne." Miss Marple remained calm. "Did she speak?" "No, but she seemed frightened, like she wanted to come out but couldn't." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Why come here to tell me?" "Because I didn't know who else would believe me," Violet said, close to tears. And I've remembered something. A letter from Miss Barton. It was sent to me just before she died, but I hadn't opened it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "She mentioned Lavender Dell. She wrote, 'If anything happens to me, tell Miss Marple. I believe she's the only one who understands.'" Violet handed her the letter, the paper trembling between her fingers. Miss Marple opened it carefully. The message was brief, but piercing. "The woman knows who she is. I've found the link: Harriet Dawn's cottage, and a man who used to bring parcels there during the war. He now lives in St. Anne's Mead. I believe he is watching her. He may try to silence her as they silenced Eleanor. If I am silenced, tell Jane. No name was given, but a man who delivered parcels during the war, who now lived quietly in the village." Miss Marple thought at once of Mr. Lytton, the unassuming librarian with his old knowledge, his gentle voice and his odd avoidance when asked about the guidebook, his habit of accidentally misfiling volumes, his vague claim of not recognizing the name Eleanor Vine, when he had clearly catalogued her estate's history. She rose. "Violet, dear, would you stay here for a little while? There's something I must do." By the time she arrived at the library, it was nearly closing. Mr. Lytton stood behind the desk, shelving the last of the day's returns. He looked up with a placid smile. "Miss Marple, more research?" "Yes," she said softly. "I'm afraid I've come with questions instead of returns." He tilted his head, puzzled. "About Eleanor Vine," she said, "and about a child hidden by Harriet Dawn, and about a woman who returned with a forgotten name and nearly remembered." "Everything." Lytton's expression did not change. You're suggesting I had something to do with it. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said gently, that you knew everything. Because you were the one who delivered the child. Silence fell, and then he smiled, slowly. Very clever, he said. But cleverness, Miss Marple, can be dangerous. Chapter 7. Truth Beneath the Dust. Miss Marple stood very still, her hands calmly folded over the handle of her umbrella as Mr. Litton's measured smile lingered between them. The soft tick of the old library clock echoed faintly overhead. Outside, the drizzle whispered against the glass panes. Inside, a silence more dangerous than any scream had taken hold. I'm old, Mr. Litton, Miss Marple said evenly. I have no interest in melodrama, but I do have an interest in justice, and it seems to me that someone is still alive who would rather not be. The librarian turned slowly, placing the last book onto a shelf with unusual care. His fingers were precise, unhurried, as though arranging thoughts more than volumes. I'm not a violent man, Miss Marple, he said. Never have been. But you must understand there are certain truths that do more harm than good when unearthed. She didn't respond, waiting. I didn't hurt Miss Barton, he added. That wasn't me, but you knew, she said. Yes, he turned to face her. I knew. Miss Marple let the silence stretch, giving him the space to speak freely. It worked. Litton exhaled heavily and leaned back against the desk. In 1939, he began. I was a postman's assistant. Green uniform, high collar. Most people don't remember the names of men who carried sacks instead of rifles. I was assigned to bring deliveries out to the countryside farms, isolated cottages. Harriet Dunn was one of them. She took in children. She took in secrets, he said. Some children, yes, but not just evacuees. Quiet arrangements, made by families who wanted their mistakes hidden. I didn't ask questions, but one day I was given a parcel from London, no return address. It wasn't wrapped like a box. It was a small case. Inside was an infant. Miss Marple's breath caught, though her expression didn't falter. I delivered the child, Litton continued, voice low. I wasn't proud of it, but I was told it was for her safety. War makes people believe strange justifications. I thought perhaps the girl would be forgotten, absorbed into some other life. Harriet never spoke of her, but I saw the girl sometimes, playing behind the hedge, yellow cardigan, always alone. He paused. Then one day, Harriet died, and the girl, she vanished. I assumed social services took her, but a few months ago, I saw her again, in St. Anne's Mead. He nodded. Only older, worn, lost, but I knew those eyes, and you never spoke to her. No. What would I say? I was the boy who delivered you like a package. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice quiet. You were afraid. I am afraid, he said, suddenly fierce. You don't understand what this could stir up. Eleanor Vine wasn't just some poor girl with a scandal. Her father, Charles Vine, had ties to certain wartime intelligence circles. There were whispers even then that the child may have been born under unusual circumstances. Miss Marple tilted her head. What kind of circumstances? Litton hesitated. Some say Eleanor was involved in something she shouldn't have been. Passing information. Or perhaps she saw something and was silenced for it. Whatever the case, when she vanished, people didn't go looking. They filed reports and shut drawers, and the child could have been evidence or liability. Either way, she was erased. Miss Marple thought of the redacted birth certificate, of the sealed record and the blacked out name. So when Miss Barton began asking questions, she said, You panicked. Litton's mouth twisted. Not panicked, alarmed. I thought if she finds out, someone else might too. And they won't just write in ledgers. They'll do worse. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. But someone did do worse, Mr. Litton. Miss Barton is dead, and Missin is missing. He stiffened. I swear to you, I didn't touch either of them. "I misled. I hid the guidebook. But I did not kill." Miss Marple believed him. "Then we must find the one who did," she said. "Before they decide Miss N is safer dead than remembered." That evening, Miss Marple returned home in time to find Violet Markham pacing her parlor rug. "I was worried," Violet said. "You were gone so long. I found answers," Miss Marple replied, removing her damp gloves. "But they've only raised more urgent questions." Violet hesitated. "Is it true about Miss Anne? That she's Eleanor Vine's daughter?" Miss Marple nodded. Violet sat down slowly. "I keep thinking about that day, when I saw her by the millstone. She looked like she was waiting for something, or someone," Miss Marple murmured. "Perhaps a person she once trusted. Perhaps someone who made her forget she was in danger." That night, Inspector Graves called with news. Another witness, an elderly man named Elias Cooper, had come forward, claiming he saw a woman enter the back garden of the vicarage 2 nights before Miss Barton's death. Not Miss Anne, someone else. She wore gloves and a scarf, Graves reported, but he noticed her walk, sharp, brisk, like a soldier, he said. Miss Marple went very still. She knew only one woman in St. Anne's Mead who walked like that, who had spent years managing the vicarage household with a military precision, who had access to the back garden gate. Mrs. Crampton. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, "Inspector, I believe it's time we paid a call." As she hung up the phone, her gaze drifted toward the window, where the moon sat like a pearl behind thinning clouds. In the woods beyond, the trees whispered, and somewhere in that darkness, Miss Anne Eleanor's daughter was still waiting to remember who she was, and waiting for someone to prove she had always mattered. Chapter 8. Tea with a vicar's wife. The Cramptons' vicarage sat in its usual genteel repose beneath the heavy branches of the elm trees, their leaves wet and trembling from the night's drizzle. The garden, once the scene of Miss N's quiet contemplations, had begun to take on a more somber tone. Petals drooped. The soil, disturbed in patches, no longer welcomed idle footsteps. It was the sort of morning where the village held its breath. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 10:30. She had chosen her lavender wool coat and a neat hat with a navy ribbon. Her shoes, freshly polished, stepped lightly on the flagstones as she rang the bell. Mrs. Crampton answered the door herself. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, her face unreadable. "What an unexpected pleasure. I hoped you might spare me a few minutes," Miss Marple said gently. "It's a morning for warm tea and quiet conversation." Mrs. Crampton hesitated a moment too long, then stepped back. "Of course, the drawing room is warm." They passed through the front hall, where a clock ticked softly, and into a room neatly arranged with lace doilies and a fading portrait of Reverend Crampton's predecessor. Miss Marple took a seat nearest the window, her eyes flicking only briefly to the sideboard. A fresh arrangement of dahlias stood there, yellow. Mrs. Crampton poured the tea herself, the clink of the porcelain against the tray sharpened the quiet. "You've had a difficult few weeks," Miss Marple said softly. "It's no small thing to offer one's home to a stranger." Mrs. Crampton gave a brittle smile. "It was my husband's idea. Still, you bore the burden of it. Meals, care, linen, the yellow cardigan." A pause. She had none of her own things, Mrs. Crampton said, her voice still level. "I found something suitable from the parish box, and the button that went missing." Mrs. Crampton's eyes flicked up. "Pardon?" "One of the cardigan's buttons. It was found near the path to the woods. I hadn't noticed any missing." Miss Marple stirred her tea, then set the spoon down with care. "There was something curious about your guest," she said. She remembered very little, but certain things, the scent of lavender, the cold feel of brass remained. Triggers, we might call them. Often, the subconscious preserves what the conscious mind suppresses. Mrs. Crampton sat straighter. "I'm not sure I follow." I believe she came here not by accident, but because this place St. Anne's Mead held the keys to her past, and when Miss Barton helped her begin unlocking it, someone grew very frightened. Stillness settled between them. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. I spoke to Elias Cooper yesterday. He saw someone enter the vicarage garden late at night. A woman walking sharply, with gloved hands and purpose. Not Miss Anne, and not the Reverend. Mrs. Crampton's hand froze mid-pour. I asked myself. Miss Marple went on, who in this village would fear Eleanor Vine's return the most? And it occurred to me someone who had ties to the Vine family. Someone who had reason to silence the scandal of an illegitimate child. Someone who had once been, let's say, in service. The teapot trembled as Mrs. Crampton placed it down. I checked the old domestic registries, Miss Marple said. Before she was married, you were listed as Miriam Thorne, housemaid to the Vine estate. Now, the color left Mrs. Crampton's face. You knew Eleanor, Miss Marple said gently. Perhaps admired her, or envied her. She ruined everything, Mrs. Crampton whispered. Her weakness, her shame. I was the one who kept that house running, while she wept and wrote poetry. Her father, he trusted me. I was the one he confided in. You were loyal to Charles Vine. I was promised a future. But that child, she was a stain. When Eleanor ran off, I saw the chance to preserve what he'd built. I helped arrange it. The baby would disappear. Harriet Dunn would raise her, and no one would ask questions. And Eleanor? Mrs. Crampton's mouth twisted. She didn't vanish. She was sent away, kept under surveillance. She died in a sanatorium in 1944. A broken thing. I thought it was done. Miss Marple let the silence settle. But then the child returned, she said. I didn't know who she was at first, Mrs. Crampton said quietly. Not until I saw her near the hedge. The way she touched the lavender. The way she looked at the brass knocker. It was like watching Eleanor's ghost. So you watched her. I had to. If she remembered everything, the past would come clawing back. My husband doesn't know. He thinks I'm pious and kind. I am kind. I kept her safe here. You drugged her. Mrs. Crampton flinched. The teas, Miss Marple said. Chamomile, laced with something stronger. It made her docile, fogged. I never hurt her. But Miss Barton began asking questions. Miss Marple said, and you followed her that night. Mrs. Crampton stood suddenly, fists clenched. I only meant to speak to her, to persuade her to stop. She said she'd already written letters, that she'd uncovered the girl's name. I panicked. She turned away from you, Miss Marple said. You seized her arm. She fell, Mrs. Crampton said flatly. She slipped on the path. I didn't mean to. She struck her head. I thought if I left her there, it might look like an accident. Miss Marple's voice was soft but unwavering. You strangled her, after the fall. To be sure, Mrs. Crampton closed her eyes. I didn't want to, but she knew. And then the girl fled. I searched for her, but she vanished again. Like a shadow, like her mother. There was a long pause. Miss Marple rose. I believe you meant to preserve peace. But peace built on silence cannot last. I'll ask Inspector Graves to come speak with you. Mrs. Crampton didn't resist. She sat back down, hands clasped in her lap like a penitent at confession. Miss Marple stepped into the hall just as the grandfather clock struck 11. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, and somewhere near the old woods, beneath trees soaked in memory, the woman once called missing might finally begin to remember who she truly was. Chapter 9. The Woman Beneath the Name. Inspector Graves arrived at the vicarage within the hour, having received Miss Marple's quiet summons by telephone. She did not dramatize. She merely stated that it was time, and Graves, who had learned to listen to her tone above her words, brought a notebook and an officer without argument. Mrs. Crampton made no attempt to deny what she had said. She sat in her parlor, spine straight, voice calm. confessing to everything with the quiet dignity of a woman who had lived too long. Inside her own self-righteousness, "I thought I was protecting the village," she said. "And perhaps I was. But it didn't matter, did it? In the end, she came back. She didn't weep. She didn't even blink. She only lowered her gaze as Graves read her rights. The Reverend, summoned from a pastoral visit, stood in the doorway looking pale, not at his wife, but at the floor, as though if he kept his eyes on the rug, he might avoid seeing the cracks forming in his world. By mid-afternoon, word had spread that the village didn't erupt. It rarely did. But in every kitchen and every corner shop, teacups were held more tightly. Voices dropped to whispers and glances sharpened. The quiet vicar's wife, the murder, the truth about the stranger who had walked into their lives. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had turned her thoughts to the woods. She had not forgotten Violet's sighting Miss Anne, or the woman now believed to be Margaret Eleanor Vine, had last been seen by the old millstone, then disappeared again into the tangle of trees and memory. But the weather had since cleared, and the earth might hold answers with Violet's help. She retraced the steps from the village green, through the lower path, and into the heart of the woods where the clearing opened near the broken stone. "There," Violet said, pointing. "That's where I saw her, standing just there, beside that stump. She looked at me just for a second. Then she stepped back." Miss Marple knelt, examining the ground. The leaves were damp, but not muddy. There were faint impressions, boot marks, light, scattered. But what caught her attention was the woven bundle of lavender placed neatly by the stone. Bound with a strip of torn cloth, she left a marker. Miss Marple said, "Do you think she's still out here? She's waiting, but not just anywhere." Miss Marple looked toward the denser trees to the east. "There's an old hunting cabin in that direction. It hasn't been used in decades. If she remembered it, she might have gone there." They walked slowly, the hush of the forest broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. The cabin, when it appeared, was little more than a shadow among the trees' roof bowed, moss along the eaves, but the door had been cleared of debris. Someone had been here. Miss Marple approached and knocked gently. A long pause, then the creak of floorboards inside. The door opened. And there she stood, the woman they had called Miss Anne. Her hair was tied back, her face pale, but her eyes were clear now, frightened, yes, but no longer lost. She looked at Miss Marple and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You know who I am?" "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "And so do you." Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of lavender and damp bark. A blanket had been laid on the floor, along with a tin of biscuits, a flask of water. Margaret Eleanor Vine, no longer Nameless, sat slowly, hands folded in her lap. "I remembered in pieces," she said. "Little flashes, a staircase, a woman's voice, a lullaby, and then Harriet's house, the window with the cracked corner, the brass handle that was always cold in winter. You were taken there as a child." Miss Marple said gently, "I wasn't unwanted. I was removed, yes, and hidden, because you were a scandal to someone." Margaret nodded. "I didn't remember my mother's face, but I remember her sadness. She used to hum when she brushed my hair, something soft and low. I didn't even know it was a memory until I heard someone else hum it in the village. That was when it started to come back." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Why did you run after Miss Barton was killed?" "Because someone came to the garden," she said. "That night, after I went to bed, I heard voices. I looked from the window and saw them, Miss Barton and another woman, by the hedge. I heard them arguing. Then Miss Barton cried out. I panicked. I thought I would be next." "You weren't wrong," Miss Marple said softly. "But it's over now." Margaret looked away. "I've never belonged anywhere, not even to myself. What happens now?" Miss Marple reached for her hand. "Now, we help you reclaim what was taken from you." In the fading light, surrounded by the hush of trees that had held too many secrets, the woman who had once forgotten her name let herself be remembered again. And far away in the village, the bells of St. Anne's rang once more, not for morning, but as if marking the end of a long-forgotten sentence. Chapter 10. The Woman Who Remembered Herself. 3 days after the arrest of Mrs. Crampton, the village of St. Anne's Mead began, as villages do, to pretend it had never been touched by scandal. The shops reopened with polished windows and forced smiles. The vicar returned to his sermons with a face more lined than before. The autumn winds swept fallen leaves across the green, and the post office received its new clerk, young, chipper, and blissfully unaware of how her predecessor had died with a name on her lips. Only Miss Marple, with her gentle step and sharp mind, seemed untouched by the village's collective amnesia. She walked the same paths, visited the same baker, and tended to her garden with quiet attention. But within her lay the echo of a story not easily told, and certainly not to those who valued peace over truth. It was late afternoon when Inspector Graves joined her for tea in her rose-covered parlor. He sat with his usual awkward stiffness, a man better suited to evidence rooms than embroidery pillows. "She's safe now," he said, lifting his cup. "Margaret. We've confirmed her identity through the old hospital records. Eleanor Vine gave birth in a private wing of St. Bartholomew's under a false name. Charles Vine pulled strings to have it sealed. The child was passed quietly to Harriet Dunn, under instructions never to reveal her origin." Miss Marple nodded. "It was the kind of arrangement respectable families made during wartime. Easier to erase the inconvenient than confront it." Graves sighed. "She won't press charges against Mrs. Crampton, said too much has already been buried. But the Crown will proceed with the murder charge for Miss Barton. It's not negotiable. And Mrs. Crampton." He hesitated, still claiming it was an accident. "But she's not resisting. She seems almost relieved." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "because the lie she's carried for so long has finally ended. She built her life on the ashes of another woman's ruin. She tried to keep it tidy. But you cannot keep ghosts in order." Graves looked at her thoughtfully. "And Margaret? She's staying in Chudleigh for now, quietly. There's a cousin of Eleanor's who's offered her a room. They remember Eleanor fondly. And Margaret is starting to paint again." "Paint?" "Yes," said Miss Marple with a smile. "It seems talent, like memory, has a way of surviving. She says it helps make sense of the fragments." Graves leaned back, then gave her a rare, lopsided smile. "I'll never quite understand how you put it together. I had no idea about Mrs. Crampton." "You weren't meant to," Miss Marple said. "She was very careful. But careful people often assume no one is watching. She revealed herself, not in what she said, but in what she withheld. Her detachment, her convenience, the way she always managed to be just out of the room when the truth was spoken." Graves sipped his tea. "Still clever deduction." "It wasn't deduction," she replied softly. "It was understanding. Of guilt, of resentment, of the way a woman might hide behind piety and cleanliness while justifying something terrible as, for the greater good." He nodded, subdued as he rose to leave. Miss Marple followed him to the door. "Inspector," she said, "do keep an eye on Violet Markham, won't you?" He raised an eyebrow. "Miss Markham? She's stronger than she thinks, but she's been brushed by too much grief lately. Sometimes it's the witnesses, those who carry secrets rather than commit crimes, who are most easily lost." He tipped his hat and stepped into the chill dusk, alone again. Miss Marple returned to her armchair. The fire crackled gently. On her lap sat a letter, recently delivered, with the faint scent of lavender on its paper. "Dear Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you for finding me when I didn't know I was lost, for seeing past the silence, for naming me when no one else dared. I remember now, not all at once, but in moments. My mother's voice, the brass of the doorknob, The yellow cardigan I once wore when Harriet brushed my hair. I remember hiding behind the hedge. I remember the lullaby. I've begun to paint the house. Lavender Dell, not as it was but as it lives in my memory. My hand still shakes sometimes, but it is mine. I am mine. With deepest gratitude, Margaret Eleanor Vine. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in her small drawer beneath the clock. Outside, the sky darkened to a shade of violet. Somewhere far off, a bell rang from the church tower. She reached for her knitting, resuming a pattern she'd put down days earlier. A cable stitch, intricate, deceptive. It looked twisted to the untrained eye, but every crossing led, eventually, back to the beginning. Human nature, she thought, was very much like that. Twisted, yes, but always seeking to resolve itself. Even if it took decades. The fire hissed. The teacup cooled. And Miss Marple, ever quiet, ever watching, continued her work beneath the ticking clock, her needles steady, her thoughts serene. The story had ended, but the lessons, as always, remained.